Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to the Retail Tales, a podcast where we exclusively discuss all things AI across the retail value chain. I am Saurabh, and I'm your host for this podcast. Before we discuss the core topic of today's episode, let me share with you all a recent experience of mine. A few weeks ago, on this bright Wednesday morning, I took the New York City subway to a client office in Manhattan. I had a client workshop to lead and deliver. It was focused on the topic of GenAI governance. I reached a little early and sat myself down in a Starbucks nearby. Went through the material and the speaking notes and made some last-minute tweaks, the usual stuff. Overall, I felt prepared. I mean, as prepared as I could have been for this 3-hour workshop with the client and his team. The main client, let's call him Brad. He's the CAIO of this global retail and consumer products company. He was given my name and credentials by one of my colleagues who had worked with him in the past. And so Brad reached out and requested this workshop. Anyway, my team and I reached the client's office, checked in, and were directed to the conference room. It was a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 36th floor of their Manhattan office. We sat down and started setting up the room for the workshop. A few minutes later, Brad entered the room and asked me to step out for a private conversation. In the next 10 minutes or so, he gave me the full context of the situation. He spoke about his role, about the expectations, and about the last 11 months or so. To give you all that context and paint a better picture to underscore the importance and significance of this workshop, let me transport you back in time for a bit. About 11 months ago, the CEO of this company, visionary leader himself, assigned Brad the responsibility of taking a more focused and strategic approach towards generative AI. Brad had been at this company for, close to 7 years. And during his tenure, he had successfully led several analytics initiatives for the company. Naturally, he was the front runner for this role. The CEO asked him to oversee all GenAI initiatives across the company, from ideation to development to then value realization. For him, it was an exciting opportunity. The kind which he had been looking for at least a couple of years now. A thing to note here is that AI wasn't anything new to this retail and consumer products company. They had been working on, machine learning, data science, and analytics for a few years already. However, there was hardly any enterprise vision for it so far. Their efforts were limited to a handful of functions. But even then, better than some of their direct competitors. Honestly speaking, and given all what I know now, if I had known about it when Brad took the role, I would have rated this company a solid 5 on a scale of 10 for AI maturity, maybe even a little higher on their AI engineering and technology capabilities. So Brad wasn't starting from zero, which gave him a lot of confidence, and he grabbed this opportunity with both hands. And so began his journey. Like any other leader, Brad wanted to start strong, but he also knew that he would need external help to set up a strong GenAI framework and establish robust governance and associated processes to support the engineering capabilities of his company. And with that in mind, he hired a boutique consulting firm to help him define the overall strategy for, his company's AI ambitions. His team worked with this consulting firm for 2 months, and they established the North Star vision, the North Star GenAI vision, designed a governance process to drive ideation to value realization cycle for the generative AI opportunities, and then created a list of industry-leading GenAI use cases for his team to consider. it was after this period of 2 months that things started to change. As Brad's team started executing the strategy internally, the initial excitement began to wane. And somehow, the governance process became the poster child of all problems. The same governance process that was designed to drive the ideation to value realization cycle, which, by the way, looked super promising on paper, was perceived as overly bureaucratic and slow. It started causing frustration among the teams that were eager to implement GenAI solutions within the organization. Business units and functions started clamoring for faster actions. The resistance wasn't just about the pace, though. Quite a lot of Brad's peers on the business side felt that the governance framework imposed by Brad's team was too rigid and did not account for the dynamic nature of their operational needs. His team, as you can imagine, was relegated to being gatekeepers more than anything else. And that became a point of contention, as it seemed to, stifle innovation rather than fostering it. Cut to the day of the workshop. Brad has not been able to make progress in almost a year. So much so that in the last 11 months since he took the CAIO role, he has not delivered tangible results for his company. In fact, Brad also seems to be convinced that the current governance process is the root cause of all problems, and it needs to be replaced with a much nimbler process. He wants to start from scratch, completely go back to the drawing board, start from scratch, and design a net new governance process. He has a meeting coming up with the CEO in late August, in which he's supposed to provide his point of view on the learnings from the generative AI journey so far for the company. He's also supposed to talk about a plan of action for future progress and, addressing the concerns of other leaders in the company. Anyway, so with all that, as I re-entered the conference room after my enlightening private conversations with Brad, I saw 5 of his directs already seated in the room, all seemingly eager to get started. Now, the content that my team and I had prepared for this workshop was fully focused on industry-leading practices for GenAI governance. But Brad had just told me about his real problem, his real situation. And did I tell you that I was meeting Brad for the first time? Yes, I was meeting him for the first time. And for him to be this open and transparent about his situation, I could not have proceeded with our well-curated content and the perfect narrative. To me, the new topic of the workshop was accelerating the path to GenAI value realization through a nimble governance process. The bad news was that we didn't have any slides for this new topic. But the good news was that we had 2 large-sized whiteboards in the room. So, in that moment, I decided to tweak the format of our discussion from workshop to a working session, if you know what I mean. After the initial rounds of introductions and pleasantries, I opened the session with these statements. I said, it's almost impossible to design an onerous and cumbersome governance process. The execution of a simple-looking governance process, though, is what could make it onerous and slow. So you don't necessarily need to design a net new GenAI governance process, but you definitely need to rethink the execution of your current one. And that set the tone for the rest of the discussion. It was extremely engaging, turned out to be one of those unique sessions where strategy meets execution. Brad and his team were quite pleased with the final outcome and even asked for our help in operationalizing their existing governance process. Now, while that was a great day at the office, I thought it's really not that unique of a situation which Brad found himself to be in. If not executed properly, AI and GenAI governance processes tend to become very slow, very bureaucratic for many organizations. So I thought of sharing kind of a summarized version of my thoughts with all of you as well in this episode, and especially when it comes to executing GenAI governance process. That is what we are going to cover in the rest of the episode today. Look, the art of making GenAI governance process drive acceleration on the path to value realization is really rooted in making small yet crucial changes. If you look at any GenAI governance process, by design, it's a very simple and uncomplicated process. Typically, it has 5 high-level steps. You can call these steps by different names, but still there are more or less 5 steps. Starts with ideate or intake step, focused on identifying potential GenAI use cases with a top-down or bottom-up approach. This is then followed by prioritize step as the next one, where GenAI use cases are assessed and selected based on predefined criteria such as ROI, cost, speed to market, strategic capability, and so on and so forth. Then comes the mobilize step in the process, which is focused on really building momentum by organizing capabilities to demonstrate the value and feasibility and plan for scaling. This is then followed by activate step, which is all about building, deploying, and scaling GenAI use cases. And finally, realize step, which is for working with business units very closely, with the leaders very closely to capture value against the original business case of these use cases. So you see, a typical process is quite simple as far as the design is concerned. Intake, prioritize, mobilize, activate, and realize. Now, as I said earlier, what makes this simple-looking process, or what could make this simple-looking process onerous and cumbersome, is how it's executed. If you consider the overall GenAI governance process, there are typically 4 main roadblocks that contribute to making the process extremely slow. There could be way too many stakeholders in the process, which sometimes gets even more compounded by lack of clear roles and responsibilities and lack of clarity with respect to decision rights. It's one thing to define all of this, but a completely different thing to operationalize it. That's where the rubber meets the road. Then there could be an issue of lack of clarity on prioritization and exit criteria for generative AI use cases. How and which ones to prioritize is definitely important, but when to stop working on a use case is also very critical, the exit criteria. Just because you prioritized a generative AI use case some time ago doesn't mean you must see it through, even if it stops making sense from an ROI perspective. Another roadblock that companies tend to struggle with is when and if central GenAI team starts acting like a gatekeeper instead of being an accelerator or an enabler. The role of generative AI team is quite crucial in keeping the governance process nimble. And finally, one of the most common reasons for a slow governance process is excessive administrative overhead. Frequent meetings, number of governance forums, analysis paralysis for each use case, and honestly, talking about the plan more than activating it. Even one of these roadblocks is enough to make a simple governance process extremely slow, but more than one of these could even bring the entire initiative to a standstill, severely hindering innovation and progress with GenAI across the organization. In the case of Brad and his company, by the way, 3 of these roadblocks were at play. Okay, now that we've spoken about the roadblocks, let me share my thoughts on how to make each of these 5 governance process steps more efficient, which should eventually result in making the whole governance process much nimbler. I'm going to talk about 3 tactical principles for each of these steps, and I call them Nimble Principles of GenAI governance. So let's start with the intake step. The first Nimble principle for intake step is GenAI literacy among stakeholders, especially for the ones helping with ideation or intake. GenAI literacy is not like it's not like GenAI 101 training or a lunch and learn exercise where you deliver one training once and you're done. It's more like a program where stakeholders must learn about art of the possible, about the AI first mindset, how to apply that mindset in their regular jobs, and about risks and limitations of the capabilities. It's also about learning the difference between where GenAI could be applied and where GenAI should be applied. It's an ongoing effort, and it's an ongoing initiative, really, especially since the pace of GenAI advancements are far outpacing the knowledge and adoption today. The second Nimble principle for intake step is to not only hold the use case sponsor accountable to prepare the business case for GenAI, but also enable them and incentivize them for doing so by accelerating their ideas through the governance process. This will avoid multiple back and forth for the central GenAI teams to gather all the required information and save that critical time. And then the final principle for intake step is to publish a repository of GenAI use cases and their details, the ones that are complete and delivered, and the ones that are underway. It will help save time by avoiding assessment of duplicate ideas that keep coming through the funnel. Let's move on to the next step of the process. On the prioritize step, the first principle is to focus on end-to-end and transformational use cases. The kind of use cases that go beyond efficiency, speed, and insights. The way I see it, these three factors have now become more or less table stakes for GenAI use cases for retail companies. But retail companies must evaluate GenAI use cases on their potential to grow market share, build new services and products, and enable non-labor cost savings for bottom-line optimization. Just focusing on efficiency, speed, and insights, it's like leaving money on the table or leveraging your scarce resources to, at best, get at par with your competition. Beating your competition is a different ballgame altogether. It requires the retail company to build a moat by leveraging GenAI capabilities. The second principle for this step is to establish a deterministic way of making build versus buy decisions for GenAI applications or products or for models and even for talent. It's very crucial for a retail company to not have to start from scratch on their path to value realization. But even more crucial is to know how to determine what to buy versus what to build. And then the last Nimble principle for this step is validating end-to-end ROI for each and every GenAI use case that needs to be prioritized. And end-to-end ROI includes TCO, total cost of ownership, tangible value of the use case, and even, qualitative and foundational value of a generative AI use case. This is also extremely critical because this validated business case must become the baseline against which delivered value should be compared. All right, now the next step in the governance process is mobilize. So let's look at the three Nimble principles for this step. The first Nimble principle of mobilize step is to start small and assess value and usability of prioritized generative AI use cases with a proof of concept or a pilot. Most retail companies out there invest in POCs or pilots to assess engineering feasibility. But what's also important is assessing value and usability. Use the same pilot or the same POC construct to do that also. Engineering feasibility assessment will only tell you whether a use case can be delivered or not, and it can be scaled or not. But retailers must also assess whether the use case should be delivered or not from value and usability perspectives. The second principle of mobilize step is for generative AI teams to stay product focused rather than project focused. Basically, GenAI teams must ensure dedicated capacity and capabilities for, the prioritized use cases with a product mindset. Look, projects are transactional. You finish one, you get onto the other. GenAI use cases are longer-term commitments for an organization to unlock their full value. And on this journey, companies may need to work on product roadmaps, work on upgrades, and maybe even add additional features. So having a product mindset with cross-functional capabilities like product management, engineering, user experience, and business is very critical. And then the last one for Mobilize step is about planning for comms, for communications, and driving adoption at this stage. User adoption for a GenAI use case or application or a product should be planned early. Better during this stage than as an afterthought once the product is implemented or the application is developed. Retail companies that plan for regular comms and adoption at this stage typically are able to leverage user feedback during implementation stage as well, which saves critical time on the path to value realization. Okay, so moving on to the fourth step of the process, which is activate. The first Nimble principle of this step is to start early to mitigate data privacy, consent, and accessibility concerns for a specific GenAI use case. The more GenAI teams preempt these issues and situations, the more time they save during the rollout and review stages. The next Nimble principle for this step is to utilize external help in building foundational GenAI capabilities that enable more strategic and valuable GenAI use cases. The internal engineering teams, if there are any for a particular company, should basically take responsibility and accountability of transformational use cases, some of which could be very core and sensitive to a retailer's business model. And then the last Nimble principle for this step is to avoid one-size-fits-all approach for model selection to optimize costs. Look, I'm sure most of you will agree that one single model is not conducive for all GenAI applications or products. And it may impact costs and ROI, sometimes even leading to rework, which, will delay the value realization aspect anyway. So having a view of the right model, the right architecture for the right application always serves well. All right, now moving on to the final step of the governance process, which is realize. The first Nimble principle of realize step is focusing on realized value rather than potential value. Realized value is the tangible value delivered for a retail company. The rest, as you all know, is smoke and mirrors. Potential value is good for intake step, but once a GenAI use case is delivered, the sole focus must be on value realized, value delivered, and that too against the original business case. The second principle of this step is about assigning quantifiable goals for leaders and holding them accountable for delivering promised value. If a leader comes in and says, here's my GenAI use case, they should be signing up for their business case and be held accountable to be delivering the promised value of that business case. Look, one thing's for sure, unless business leaders or sponsoring leaders are held accountable, GenAI capabilities will likely stay at experimentation stage. For true GenAI transformation, retail companies need their business leaders to be held accountable for actively driving adoption, integrating these technologies into core business processes, and demonstrating measurable outcomes that align with retail companies' strategic objectives. And now the last principle of the realized stage is ensuring realized value to be one of the most critical metrics to decide whether to progress further on the roadmap of a generative AI use case or not. If the original GenAI use case has not delivered its promised value? Does it really make sense to continue investing resources in it? It's essential to critically assess the outcomes and decide if further investment in a specific generative AI use case is justified, or if it would be more prudent to pivot and redirect efforts and resources towards more promising opportunities. All right, now that I've spoken about these 15 Nimble principles across the 5 stages, I'll round it off by adding the most important one of them all, and that is change management. And the reason why I kept it for the last and tagged it as the most important one is because leaders must realize that it's not limited to a specific step of the governance process. It must be executed throughout the process, across each and every step. Change management is crucial, absolutely crucial, because it addresses the human aspect of GenAI transformation. But it's even more crucial to plan for it early and execute it throughout, and not just an afterthought. That will ensure that stakeholders are engaged, informed, and prepared for the changes that GenAI initiatives bring about at all stages of the lifecycle. It also reduces friction among different parts of the organization, which, to a large extent, definitely helps save time and makes the overall ideation to value realization path much, much smoother. Okay, I know we covered a lot of ground today in this episode. But if there's one thing, and one thing only, that you must remember from this episode today, it's this. The key to success with your GenAI initiatives lies not in designing an overly complex or a simple governance process, but in executing it with agility and focus. The same process can be made extremely onerous by how a retail company executes it. So look at the existing GenAI governance process within your company and ask yourself, is it fast-paced enough? Is it nimble enough? And if not, now you know some of the critical principles to make it faster and nimbler. And on that note, it's a wrap on this episode. I really hope it was helpful. Thanks for listening. Here's me, Saurabh, signing off. If you like the content, don't forget to follow this show to keep learning a thing or two about retail AI. You can follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to this show on Spotify or Apple. Join me in the next episode of The Retail Tales, a show which is exclusively focused on exploring all things AI across the retail value chain. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay curious.